Right, okay. And there are microphones in front of you, who knew? And I think you press the button to speak and then unpress the button not to speak. Right, I'll do my air hostess thing here. In the event of an alarm sounding, please leave the room calmly via the lobby area and the main door of the City Hall, turn right, walk down the ramp towards the cathedral. The assembly point is in front of the cathedral. Tea and coffee will be served through the meeting. Okay, I think because we're in person, let's start with a very quick introduction and just say who you are and who you're representing. And I'll start with Simon.
Hi, yes, Simon Eakins. I'm Finance Director at Cathedral Schools Trust and Simon Eakins, Finance Director at Cathedral Schools Trust, and I represent one of the Academy Primary representatives.
Rob?
Oh, sorry, Rob Endley. I'm Rob Endley. I'm the Local Secretary for the NASUWT and the Education TU rep on this forum.
Christine Townsend, I'm the Executive Member for Children.
Vic Firmer, I'm the Director of Education for Bristol City Council.
Ben Hegarty, I'm the Finance Business Partner for Children Education.
Stephen Goodwin, I'm Finance Manager for Bristol City Council.
Nicole Dighton, Executive Head of Briarwood School and Special Schools Representative.
I'm Melanie Bunt, I'm Business Manager at St Mary Redcliffe and Temple Secondary, and I'm the Maintain Secondary Rep.
Hi everyone, I'm Louise Malik. I'm the Chief Financial and Operating Officer at the Lighthouse Schools Partnership, and I'm representing primary academies.
I'm Mercha Clark. I'm on the Finance Committee at St John's Primary School, and I'm a maintained primary school rep.
I'm Dr. Danny Doyle. I'm the CEO of the Newman Catholic Trust. I've been asked to sit on by Clifton Darcis, and I'm Primary Academies representative as well.
Hi, I'm Mandy Cheshire. I work with St Bede's Catholic College. I'm representing secondary governors.
Hi, I'm Alistair Brown. I'm Governor of Redcliffe Nursery School and representing the Maintain Nursery Schools sector on the Schools Forum.
Hello, I'm Nick Bailey. I'm a Head Teacher at Brunel Field Primary School, here representing Primary Maintained.
Anna Keenan, Democratic Services, the new clerk to the forum.
I'm Steve, Chair. I'm also Chair at North Star Academy Trust, and we have a ALP in our group. And can I welcome Ben, because I think it's your first meeting, and then welcome Anna. Thank you. Welcome. I think we've got some apologies for absence. We've got from the primaries, we've got Lee, and I think Murch has got his vote. We've got Steve Mills from Unison. Secondaries, I've got Cameron Shaw, Kate Peel and Sarah Lovell. And non-school, Joe Willis and Lorraine Gaskin and Andy Rothery. So I think we've checked where meeting is Corbett. Very good, very good. So Hannah's taken over, clerking. Oh, and yeah, and so welcome Danny as well. So thank you. We do have some vacancies. One primary head teacher representing maintained schools, primary head teacher representing academy schools, 2 primary governors representing academy schools, and 1 head teacher representing PRU schools. Right? So if forum members can percolate and contact to assist in filling those vacancies. Do we? is there a, if people want to send a message out to all the schools, is there a sort of contact list or email list?
Yes, there is. So what we can do is, I think working with Democratic Services, put out a nominations process for any areas we've got gaps, and that can go to all schools and trusts.
Okay, thank you. Okay, have any panel members got any interest to declare in relation to items of business? Very good. Okay, we'll go on to the agenda item 3. Oh, by the way, so we're sort of scheduled till 7 o'clock. If we can finish sooner, we'll finish sooner. However, it's an opportunity for people to speak, so we'll take the opportunity. Okay, minutes of the previous meeting. Has anybody got any comments of substance or fact on those? Okay, in which case I'll move that they're correct record. And have we got a seconder? Okay, thank you. Item 4, we have got an action tracker has now been implemented. And there weren't any actions from the last meeting. No, so, but I think that's good. That's good practice. Right, the next item is the standard item. This is the Dedicated Schools Grant Budget Monitor. So it's the 2025 DSG forecast as at period 5, and we're going to be invited to note the report. So Steve, if I can hand over to you.
Thank you. So item 5 is the, as the Chair said, the standard monitor information for the Dedicated Schools Grant. This is as at period 5, covering the period to August 2025, and it's the latest published information in line with the quarterly reporting to the Council. This is for information only, but happy to take any questions that arise. Essentially, the Dedicated Schools Grant, as Section 3 refers to, is subject to changes in year. We have had a change in July, so this is an update since the previous report, of an additional 459,000, which is a usual adjustment in respect to validated high needs places, import-export, which tracks the numbers of children entering or leaving Bristol, educated in other areas, and the early years adjustment, which always takes place in July. In terms of the monitoring, we are reporting at period 5 a 36.3 million in-year deficit, which is 6.6% of the Dedicated Schools Grant. And that is broken down in section 3.5 into the various blocks which we report for information. As we've mentioned in previous forums, the DFE count the bottom line. They don't look at the individual breakdowns per block for school central services, early years, etc. They just look at the total Dedicated Schools Grant position. You'll see it is adjusted by the contributions from the safety valve agreement, and then we also have Bristol City Council's contribution as part of that same agreement. The detail in the report explains the various movements and the variance between the previous report in period 2 to period 5, and then the narrative towards the end of the report just again articulates the reasons for the pressures and the variations in the budget forecast. So the paper's been previously circulated, the detail is there. If anybody has any questions, we're happy to take them.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Any? Yeah, Louise?
Thank you. I've got 2, if that's okay. One is to do with the core place funding and the reduction since period 2 of that, and just if you could give us an idea why that would be when we're trying to increase specialist places. And the second one is just if you could explain again this realignment amount of 8.3. I didn't really understand what that was.
In terms of the...
Yeah, in the table it's got a realignment of for budget, DSG management plan?
Yeah, so basically, from period 2, we have the estimated budget forecast for the financial year, which is then adjusted in year in line with current activity, current forecast. So it's just basically the realignment of the budget to reflect the more accurate forecasts. So it's just the technical terminology, if you like, for what we call environments, where we're moving the budgets in between those various areas, just to reflect the true and more accurate forecast against each of those separate lines. The
Steve, can you ever go at saying that even more simply, please?
So, in terms of budget management, when we get to period 2, which is the first reporting period, that's based on the initial estimated budgets that are based on the full council budget setting in February, and then we have what's called the statutory Section 251 budget return to the Department for Education. That gets submitted in April. So that informs the period 2 report at the start of the year, which is the best guess at that particular point in time. Now obviously, as the year progresses and we see different volumes of activity, different pressures, we might have more places developed aligned to the capital strategy, then we have to basically realign the budget to make sure it reflects the most accurate forecast. So we do, internally, we will have the budget mechanics behind the scenes. So we'll update our financial mainframe system to align to the revised budget. So we have an original budget, which is period 2. Then we move to a revised budget at each of the subsequent monitoring periods. So we're constantly revising those budgets through what's called budget environments to move budgets from one area to another to reflect where that current activity is taking place. So it's all, the revised budget always reflects the most accurate and most transparent forecast that we can have based on the volume of activity, the number of EHCPs, education, health and care plans going through the system, the number of places being developed in provisions across the city, the number of children going out into independent non-maintained places. All of those come with a financial transaction behind them where we need to reflect that in the budget. So it's a constantly evolving forecast so that we can present the most accurate information to council and to schools forum. And then the core place.
Sorry, just follow up on that. So how does this report tell us what that 8.3 is made up of? You know, what's caused that realignment? What's gone up and what's gone down to?
Yeah, I suppose it doesn't, but that is an action I suppose we'll take for the next. When we've brought more detailed deficit management plan reports, which we brought to the previous schools forum, that would break that down into the number of, you know, how the 8.3 million breaks down into independent non-maintained places, EHCP top-ups in mainstream schools. There's a whole load of factors behind that. So I acknowledge what you're saying now. We can bring that to be more transparent then in terms of the movements. Okay. The core place funding and the shift there of 6.4 million, again, I need to just go back and bring that to the next meeting. Other people have updated this forecast. It just says it's been recalculated for period 5 and a favourable movement. So I think at the start of the year, we anticipated more places being delivered in year. Now this might link to delays in the capital strategy and the opening of those places. So that's meant a significant change in that budget. But again, I'll bring that for clarity to the next meeting. Thank you.
Simon?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Just a kind of a question about the overall position, the high needs block. Obviously, the safety valve was entered into 24 as like a 5-year program to reduce the deficit. So, do you have meetings with the DFE at regular points, you know, during that time? And because I'm pretty sure we are off where we said we would be, but we do have, obviously, presumably, do they not take any action until 29-30, or and what, you know, at what point, you know, is, you know, what's the critical date in terms of action and potential risk, I guess?
I can answer that. So So we submit so it's tri-annual, not quarterly. So there's one quarter that, and I don't know why that is actually, but there is a quarter where we don't submit. But 3 times a year, financial year, we submit an update on our progress on safety valve to the DFE. So our next submission is in early December. We meet with advisors from the DFE regularly throughout the year prior to those submissions to take them through both our progress in terms of the various policy initiatives that we are running, such as one of the first condition, for example, which was to publish a strategy, as an example, alongside then a projection of what is happening to a deficit management plan on the Heinies block over the period. Generally, we've received good feedback on progress we've made against the conditions. We recognise, I think, that the deficit is still significant. It's a significantly high deficit, but we also know that my understanding is that all local authorities that are part of Safety Valve are off track nationally, and I think the National Audit Office did a report on this calendar year, and the national debt was on the Heinies block across all local authorities, not just those with a safety valve agreement, was 8 billion. So that's not to say that Bristol's unique or special in that. It's just to recognise, I think, that there's pressure in the Heinies block in probably 3/4 of local authorities nationally. But I think where we've had good feedback, it's been because of the progress we've made on the conditions, on the way that we're continuing to deliver our statutory duties, and the improvement journey that we're on. So I don't know if that answers your question, Simon. But
yeah, it does. And I guess at a high level, what's the main reason why we're behind? Is it both a mixture of bigger draws on the funding, so like there's just more need and so more income or more expenditures going out, or is it more the delays in the mitigations, i.e., it's taking more time to get the additional places and things like that?
Yeah, so there's various, I suppose, downwards and upwards pressures. I think where we've seen progress, so we've seen a positive movement. For example, we've been working really closely with our Parent Care Forum and parents to look at children who would be able to return back to local settings, for example, through a supportive process. So we have a specific team that works really closely with them. We co-produce that strategy with our Parent Care Forum, and that's been really successful. So we set ourselves a target of returning 12 children back to local settings from independent settings. We broke that target, so we got to 22 children. And what we'll be reporting to the DFE in our submission next week is that saved £1.25 million, for example, to the Heinies block. So that is part of our downward pressure. We've also seen a reduction in the average cost of placement in various different categories, and that's been, again, part of the changing demographic of the children we're supporting. So we're seeing lots of positives there. We've also been able to profile in recent decisions at the Children and Young People Committee to invest council capital in new schemes. That includes Throgmorton, that also includes St Anne's School and Henbury Court School. So these are all part of that submission. So as those schemes become real and approved in terms of capital funding being put aside, that's factored into my colleagues in finance's deficit management plan to show when that school will open and when we think that will have a financial impact on revenue. That's a downward pressure. The upward pressure that we see is predominantly the Heinies block hasn't grown in line, as you'll know, in line with the growth in the cohort, both in Bristol but also nationally. So where we've seen quite often year-on-year double-digit growth, over 10% growth year-on-year, the budget hasn't inflated by that amount. So that's our most significant pressure. But also the number of children who are supported in independent settings, as we know, because of the capital position. We've still seen delay on the Trim Valley Free School, which we're hoping we'll hear maybe some news on in the budget this week, in the autumn statement. But again, that's having a financial effect of about £6 million to the revenue on the Heinies block. And then the growth in our cohort. Obviously, we're supporting more children. We're meeting our statutory duty, but that costs, that costs funding to the Heinies block to enable that to be given to schools to support. So I don't know, Steve and Ben, if there's anything you want to add in terms of that, but we're profiling those pressures through a set of assumptions around, when projects will complete, when, what we think the forecast growth in the cohort will be. But I think it's as true a position as we can achieve with some of the assumptions and some of the unknowns nationally. Final thing I'll say is we know that there are reforms on their way early next year. We're told they were due to be in the autumn. They will now be next year. So that may change the entire context and landscape for us in this particular area of work.
Yes, just to build from that, because there seems to be a lot of risk within the situation you're describing. So maybe kind of talk to an aspect of the controls or the risk mitigation. You spoke about exceeding your target and returning some children back from the independent maintained, but as we can see in the budget, there's been an increase in there. So maybe that's one area to focus on. Are there any particular boundaries, approval thresholds or parameters that you set to be able to try and control that? Or is it just that you've got to meet need as it comes in and therefore it could be a bit of an uncontrollable?
So I think it's a bigger question, I think, in terms of we have controls in place in terms of the way that we are measuring thresholds, for example, and where that need can be met. But fundamentally, if we've got a child who requires an independent, requires a specialist provision and there isn't sufficient places in the city, or a mainstream school cannot support those needs, the statutory duty on us as a local authority is to then support that child through another setting, and that might be an independent setting, and that bears a significant greater cost than using schools like Briarwood, for example, or other local schools where we know that the cost to the Heinies block is less. I think the bigger challenge for all of us is how we promote stronger inclusion across the city, and we can support more children through mainstream settings. And I think that's where we've set up an inclusive learning service to work with schools, but also schools and trusts will need to think about themselves, how they'll be responding to the new Ofsted framework, for example, which has put inclusion at the heart of it, but also what the reforms might bring, which we think will be a far greater emphasis on inclusion in mainstream.
I had one question, and I'm not sure if it's picked up in what's been said there, which was this line about independent, non-maintained schools, where it's talking about there's an increase of 53 children, and I guess, is that a trend? Are there any actions to mitigate that? Yeah. There's a line in there which is saying independent non-maintained schools, the period 5 forecast was increased by 8 million to reflect the net increase of 53 children placed in the independent non-maintained schools. So just trying to sort of unpick that and understand that.
I think we can probably bring some analysis to the next meeting of how we see the deficit management plan forecast and what the assumptions are within it. I think probably what the paper's trying to do is explain the movements between the last submission that you'll have seen, and I mean what it won't show is the number of children we've returned back into local settings, the children that have left the system because they've perhaps they've turned 16 and maybe gone on to other support, other outcomes. Okay. So
well, if we can have something in sort of in the context and trend, then
yeah, of course.
It probably gives us a good picture rather than a snapshot.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I should say, and I'm sure Steve will correct me if I'm wrong, that where there are children joining the system, the £8 million effect is not a one-year effect. It's the assumption that they will continue in that provision for the end of that phase of their education. I think that's right, isn't it? So that's why it's a larger figure than you might be anticipating for 53.
Just on that, they used to, because I think this is the report that goes to one of the city council committees, is that right? Or it's an extract of, or But because we used to have, underneath this table, we used to actually have a further breakdown of the high needs, so showing where that money is spent, and that might help to that point as well. But that's sort of disappeared from this report. But
we brought that to the last meeting when we did the detail on the DMP report, so we did more analysis of high.
Five monitor, it says it's gone up by £8 million since between period 2 and period 5. So presumably that's just the impact in that financial year, the 8 million.
Yeah. Overall, it's the increase in the forecast. So
for the financial year.
For the financial year, but it's covering, assuming those children will stay in that education until the end of that year.
To the end of the year.
We're saying. So yeah.
Thank you.
And then obviously there is an impact in future years then if they don't move out.
Okay, so I think formally then we need to note the period 5 position which was as at the end of August 2025. Okay. And then just for clarity and meeting alignment, our next meeting is in January? 21st of January. What might we be seeing then, Steve?
The January meeting, because of the published information, will bring the quarter 3 return, which is the period covering up to the end of period 8.
Okay.
That's the latest we can provide.
Okay. Right, so we're now moving on to agenda item 6. We're starting to get a bit more forward-looking. Provisional detailed proposals for de-delegation, where the schools forum's got statutory powers and responsibilities. So purpose is to outline the local authorities' annual proposals for de-delegated items for maintained primary and secondary schools, and it's for the appropriate schools forum reps to review, consider and make decisions on, and also going to present the consultation, and then specifically reps from mainstream settings will make decisions on those. So if Steve, you can present, anybody can have a debate, and then we'll have a vote with those eligible to vote.
Okay, thank you. First of all, we'd like to thank the number of schools that did take the time to respond to the consultation exercise and to attend the briefings that we arranged before and after half term. We had 3 times more responses than the previous year, so we're pleased with that, albeit still only just over 50% of the schools, but much better response than the previous year, so thank you. In terms of this paper...
And Steve, just let me pause there. I know that was a concern of the forum last year, so yeah, thank the forum, thank yourselves and everybody. Much greater response. Thank you.
In terms of the briefings, the invitations did go out widely. They weren't very well attended, but they were really good sessions, really good questions and answers, and we do trust that the colleagues that attended did find them useful and helped to inform their responses. So next year we'll do more promotion and try and get even more responses to this consultation exercise. The difficulty we had was obviously the unknown information. We were consulting on principles and didn't have facts and figures. So we tried to articulate that throughout the exercise. But again, a good response. So this initial paper from the consultation is to look at de-delegation, where we do have the decisions required from our maintained colleagues this evening. The consultation outlined all the detail behind the de-delegated services and the amounts per pupil that were being proposed. Ultimately, we had the responses from the primary sector, which are detailed in Table 2, and the local authority proposals to contribute to the decision-making process tonight is outlined in Table 2 based on the majority of responses. So we could see for all the de-delegated items for primary schools, the vast majority voted in favour of de-delegation. So the local authority proposals are based on those majority decisions. Just to outline a bullet 3.6, we did get 100% favourable response to school improvement from the schools that did respond, albeit there was a mix between enhanced and current. The service isn't offering 2 service level agreements, so we've gone with our proposal to support the majority of responses for the enhanced service level there. And then for maintained secondary schools, exactly the same process, and we had, so the majority of items, a majority in favour, but you can see on Table 3, there was a split decision for the trade union facilities time and the trade union's health and safety roving reps. Based on our conversations with the Schools Forum Finance subgroup, the local authority recommendation, as I've said in bullet 3.7, is to propose to de-delegate both those items on the basis that it's supporting our schools that have got trade union representatives that do need to secure that reimbursement for their, the staff cover time that's required in that school. So we've got the recommendations from the local authority, and it's now subject to the vote from our maintained representatives. So maintained primary, vote on theirs, and then maintained secondary, vote on their de-delegation.
Okay, thank you. So just before we do that then, any questions, clarifications from people? No?
I just have a comment.
Yeah.
This is from the maintained primaries. I mean, last year we found it very difficult, so we're really happy that we got such a large response in comparison to last year. So I think that just needs to be restated. We also see that the one area which is difficult is the trade union facility time. So it's a marginal majority, but I think Lee, who is the other rep, and myself both felt that we should go with the de-delegation following the discussions that we had last year.
Okay, thank you. And Rob?
It's just a point of historical fact, really. The Health and Safety Roving Reps group, of which I was a part, which was begun about 7 or 8 years ago, I think, it no longer exists. It's not there. So there's no money has ever been claimed from that for at least the last 3 or 4 years that I know of. So if we need further discussion about how that came about and the mechanics behind that, but if you look through if you actually look through the account, backdate the account, I don't think any school has made a claim from the Health and Safety Roving Reps Fund for at least 3 years. And as a member of it, then we could, I don't know what the mechanism would be, maybe the EJCC would be the correct format for that, to discuss whether that actually should still exist. I take your point about the Health and Safety Roving Reps, that it's always been voted to de-delegate it, and there's no reason why the forum should know through the ether that the Health and Safety Roving Reps doesn't effectively function. Although it exists on paper, it doesn't effectively function. All the claims that are made for TU facility time are made from the TU facility pot, as far as I'm aware.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. That's helpful clarification.
Chair, can I comment?
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that, so thank you for that. And just to say, if you recall last year, when we voted not to de-delegate trade union facilities time to utilise the surplus balance that we held in reserve, that will have included any balance from the health and safety roving reps. So effectively that money that was held has been utilised. I think the best course of action for this evening is to vote not to de-delegate that item now if it's no longer a service that's being delivered, but I wasn't aware of that. I won't bore you with all the technical details of it. Essentially what's happened is that those people who are undertaking trade union facilities activities, including myself,
would use the facility fund for casework and other collective bargaining and negotiations about things. And the Health and Safety Roving Rep Group was specifically only for people like myself who are a health and safety representative going out and doing health and safety inspections on schools. The reason that came into existence is because it was made apparent that there was not health and safety trade union representation in any schools. The reality on the ground of what's happening right now is that I continue to do health and safety work in schools, but I do it as part of my facility rather than doing it as a separate roving reps group. So the health and safety work is still being undertaken, but it's being undertaken, as far as I'm aware, by the schools that are claiming remittance of my salary under the TU facility pot rather than from that.
Okay, thanks. Okay, now you can...
Yeah, it was just to agree with that, really. There was a split vote on the health and safety roving reps, and I think that represented the lack of clarity about what it was, so I think very sensible plan of action. It's obviously like to be noted that there are only 2 maintained secondary schools, so it is quite difficult when it comes to voting, and that was the one item that we did not agree on. So,
okay, I think we're going to move to the vote, and just help me. So, maintain primary representatives, put your hand up or put 2 hands up. Okay, all right, okay. Okay. Okay, so notwithstanding that slight curved ball about, so apart from what we've just talked about, which was the...
Does that only apply to secondary?
Oh, is it just applies to secondary? That's fine. Okay, thank you, thank you. Right, so the simple thing is, can I ask all those to vote in favour by show of hands if you're in line with all of the recommendations? Thank you. So I think that's unanimous, and that's fine. We now go on to secondary. Yes? Okay. Can secondary representatives indicate what are you? I don't know. Yeah.
so agreement to everything except the
Very good. Okay. Thank you. And thank you again for all the consultation and the prior work, which makes the agreement simpler. I think that is agenda item 6. Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, possibly even more complicated and as yet unknown, we will now go on to provisional detailed proposals for the funding formula. So it's to inform and seek agreement for the principles of the funding formula prior to the final applications. So I'll get Steve to talk, and then maybe I'll get Simon and people who were at the subcommittee to give perspective as well. Okay, over to you, Steve.
Okay, thank you. Before we get to item 7 in the main agenda pack, you will have all received the supplementary paper, which was distributed on Thursday last week. That was, if we can just touch on that first, so it's listed as item 7A as a supplementary item. We did receive an unexpected DFE announcement on Wednesday last week, which was about the national funding formula update for 2026-27. So I thought that was useful to discuss first, because that will inform the next paper. So essentially, you've got the outline there in terms of the funding that's been announced. The main elements of the paper do confirm the direction of travel we've considered and the elements we've already taken to schools through the consultation, and that we'll detail in item 7. So it's around the direction of travel.
Steve, sorry to break your flow.
Sorry.
Can you, just assuming not all of us have got 7A paper in front of us, can you just give us sort of a high level précis?
Okay, so the DFE announced on Wednesday last week, in advance of the autumn budget statement tomorrow, which was what's caught us off guard. We didn't expect any announcements prior to the big announcements tomorrow, around the national funding formula policy for 2026-27. And within that update, they included the provisional school funding increases, inflation, and confirmed their policy in respect to grant transfers for the pay grants, etc., the move to the minimum funding guarantee, the minimum per pupil funding levels, the schools block transfer. So lots of areas that we've put out to consultation with schools in terms of the principles have now been confirmed by the Department for Education in this pre-notification. Essentially, the headlines from that report confirm the grant transfers from the pay and national insurance contribution grants, the school budget support grant, which have been provided as separate grants in this financial year, which will be rolled into the dedicated schools grant, added to the dedicated schools grant allocation, and therefore distributed through the schools and academies funding formula next year. So that's all been confirmed. They've confirmed now in writing the mandatory move of 10% closer to the national funding formula. They've confirmed as well that the final allocations will be announced in December and updated in line with the October 2025 pupil census. Again, things we already knew. One thing in item 2.5 in that paper, if everyone sees it, is an introduction of a new free school meals extension grant with details to be announced separately, which will come into effect from September 2026. So that's to do with the extension of free school meals, to do with the changes in universal credit. So there'll be a new separate grant in respect to that. So that was a new announcement there. The grants rolling into the dedicated schools grant have been confirmed and exactly match what I've already presented to schools through the consultation exercise, apart from the minimum per pupil funding levels, where they've rounded it up by £1. So there was £1 out on my paper, so apologies for that. What was good news, but there may be some different observations from schools, is that the funding will include the grants that are transferring in, plus an additional 2.2% on average increase to all the schools' funding factors. Now, where that might not be so good news is that pay inflation is already being proposed at circa 3.2%. So there's already challenges going back to the Department for Education to say, are we going to receive another in-year pay grant to cover the gap? So we need to wait and see what the DFE might make of that. Other than that, they've confirmed the uplift to all the factors, apart from the minimum per pupil funding level, which has got the increase from the grant allocation, but no additional inflation, and they've not explained why they've done that to that particular protection. So essentially, what I've done on the update to you is provide the new national funding formula values, including the 2.2% average uplifts, including the grant transfers. And what we'll do when we take this to the next full schools forum and the schools forum finance subgroup is work through what this now means in terms of our formula scenarios. So we've got the latest figures to work to, but ultimately our overall allocation and the allocations that reach schools and academies are still subject to update for the October 2025 pupil census once we've got that announcement in December. Other key areas of the update essentially just reaffirm what I've just said around 10% closer move to the national funding formula value. Local authorities are allowed to transfer 0.5% of the schools block to other blocks. with Schools Forum approval. The minimum funding guarantee to be set between 0 and minus 0.5%. But there's another area there to say that we need to consider reviewing all authorities nationally the notional SEN aspects of the schools funding formula. So that'll be done in a separate exercise to make sure we do align with the consistent approach across local authorities in that area. The other update was in respect to the Central School Services block. Again, I've put all the details on the report, but essentially it doesn't tell us anything that we didn't already know, and it reaffirms there is a 20% reduction to the historical commitments elements of the Central School Services block. Now, what that means in reality is that we'll see a £60,000 reduction to the contribution to central support services. So we'll need to manage that within the local authority to see how we can address that gap in funding there. There's no other changes to the Central School Services block. In terms of the next steps, we need to see the December dedicated schools grant allocations, which will be updated for the October 2025 pupil census. It will include the grant transfers and the inflation, and essentially it won't, well, at this moment in time, we don't know what the high needs funding block is going to look like. So that's the one area that they've not updated so far, and early years. So we've still got lots of pieces of the jigsaw to complete. But we're waiting now for those announcements, which will be round about the 15th to the 19th of December, and then we can work through the implications of that and decipher that and translate that for future schools forums. So that was that update purely in respect to the national funding formula, but it does influence the next conversation as well.
Will that decision about the 0.5% be entirely made when that high needs block is released to you, or have you got any thoughts in advance of that where you're potentially considering it?
The 0.5% transfer from schools block to high needs. It's included in the next paper, so we've already consulted schools with that, and we've got a majority response to the consultation question. What we don't know is the figure, so that will be yours. And basically this evening we'll be looking for agreements in principle, but once we've got the funding announcements, we'll come back to Schools Forum in January to present the final figures and reach a final decision. But we have proposed the 0.5% move from schools block to high needs, which we have done for several years now, and it does align to our deficit management plan with the safety valve agreement as well.
So, Steve, do you want to now talk to agenda item 7?
Yep. To
follow on, and then we'll, and then we'll have the wider discussion. But Christine,
Chair, can I just ask a question? Yeah, it's in relation to point 5.5 about the notional send budget. This is the first time I've ever read that it says it's proportionate to both the instance and associated costs of those receiving SEN support. I don't know if anybody else in this forum understands what the SEN notional budget is, but I feel that I want to understand better what it is, how it's calculated, but also because it's saying that you're continuing to review it. So I suppose my question would be, what does it look like now? What's the intention? And I think that the question is quite big. It's quite a large question, because I also don't understand how this is calculated. If somebody else does, then please do share that with us. But I think that probably the finance people are the only people that do.
Thank you. On that point, notional SEN is probably interpreted 150 different ways across 150 authorities in terms of how you determine the notional SEN as a proportion of your formula funding factors. So we'll have 10% of basic entitlement, 100% of low prior attainment. The next authority may have completely different percentages. It's been an issue for many since it was introduced in 2013. You know, the mandatory cost threshold of £6,000 per pupil, which is this is supposed to determine that schools can contribute that for any child with an EHCP or SEN support. So there's lots of issues behind it. What is interesting in the paper they've released is the national percentages of EHCPs, education, health and care plans and SEN support, which are different percentages than I've seen on other national publications. So what we need to do is work through this, and we have reviewed it in previous years with a view to look at the schools with the highest inclusion of education, health and care plans. School support is not always totally robust, because that's up to schools to just identify on the school census whether they think a child has got any SEN support requirements. So that can be open to schools' own judgments and isn't always validated. And we've seen schools in other areas tick 100% of their pupils as requiring SEN support. Now, there isn't any formula funding attached to that, but it does skew the analysis and skew the figures. So we are going to review it. There isn't time, obviously, since the announcement on Wednesday, but we do need to look at the October census, the number of EHCPs, the number of SEN support, look at the DFE national thresholds for both areas, look at our schools that are above those thresholds, look within the high needs operational guidance if there's any additional support we can provide to those schools. So it's an ongoing assessment. I'm working with the Inclusive Learning Service as well to look at the impacts of all that analysis. It's something we obviously have to bring back in detail to a future meeting.
Thank you.
So, Christine, was...
Yeah, I mean, I understood probably about 50% of what you said. And so, yeah, so maybe we take it offline and we have a look at, I mean, we have a... You're talking in finance terms, and there's a bridge to be had.
So Steve, it sounds like it would be useful to have something specific on the agenda next time, separate from the more general funding formula, just to try and understand and unpick this, to get our collective heads around it. Is that something that can be done?
It can be done. Whether it'll make any more sense in January, I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to add that I completely agree with you, and the arrangements nationally are completely inconsistent and inappropriate and unhelpful for how we meet needs of children with special educational needs. And there was a paper that was produced a couple of years ago by the government which said how much per eligible pupil local authorities were identifying as part of the notional SEM budget, and it raised from about £13,500 per eligible pupil to about £460 per eligible pupil, so it's completely worthless. So I really hope that when we get the reforms that there will be something much better and much more consistent about how we calculate notional SEM budgets. But I would encourage, if we're going to look at notional SEM budgets, that we also look at some comparative data with other the local authorities, because actually with the local authorities I work with in the local area, Bristol's notional SEM budget is much higher than other local authorities in the nearby area. So, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, just one supplementary comment on top of that is that with the situation you described earlier and the pressures that you're facing budgetary and from a high needs point of view, LAs under this kind of pressure can inevitably find themselves leaning on the £6,000 rule more aggressively, and we're finding more pressure within schools, and you've just described as well the projected rates of inflation as well as the pay awards and whether they're funded, etc. The TAs that are providing that support, the same curriculum in place to coordinate the administration, are seeing increasing costs or are not seeing increasing the notional. So we're describing what I would maybe frame as a complex situation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Can I ask another question, but it's about the funding rates? And you mentioned that the per pupil or the minimum per pupil funding level wasn't going up. And I just wondered what number or proportion of schools in Bristol are funded at the minimum per pupil funding level. Because as you said, although a 2.2% increase is higher than I thought it would be, it still could be a challenge, as you said, against pay inflation. But for those schools on the minimum per pupil funding level where they'll get 0% increase, that presents a much, much more significant challenge. And I didn't know how many schools that affected.
I know we've got 18 schools at the minimum funding guarantee, but I'll need to come back to you with a number of schools at the minimum per pupil funding level. It's not many overall in the scheme of things in Bristol, but I'll confirm the number.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to make the point around the funding, whilst you know, things like notional funding, high needs provision for children, is a collective pressure on all of us collectively as a system. So whilst we as a local authority administer some parts of it, some of those are set nationally, as we've just described. And as I said earlier, the rising number of children who are supported nationally and locally in Bristol by the high needs block and the pressure it has on your budget is fundamentally one challenge, one complex challenge for all of us collectively, as is the challenge of retention of brilliant teaching assistants in the city and teachers and specialist teachers. It's a challenge and a concern for all of us, and we know that those are things that have a huge and positive impact on children as well. So it's something that I'm always mindful we need to be careful not to kind of separate the local authority from our schools and our place, that it is something we're all considering together, and collectively we're trying to make decisions in the best interest of children in Bristol in a complex period of time where there isn't sufficient funding to fund all of the need that's there. So the point we were making earlier, I suppose, about and the conversation I think we will immediately get into as soon as the reforms are announced will be, how do we make Bristol the most inclusive place educationally? What does that mean in the context of a curriculum review that's just launched with its recommendations, a new Ofsted framework, possibly some changes around the funding model nationally, depending on what government does with SEN, the SEN system, whole scale. So in a weird way, our conversation about notional budgets may be taken over by government announcements in January, which might save Steve having to explain the notional budget any further. But we should possibly, as a schools forum, set aside some time soon after the reforms are announced to make that determination. What does it mean for us?
Yep. Okay. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah, just go back to this notional funding. I mean, the reality is if you're taking out 6,000 for your SEND kids, you have much less available to the other kids. I mean, because it's so it doesn't really work unless you happen to have a budget that has a lot of other factors included. So if you are one of these schools which is receiving close to the minimum or the minimum, you have nowhere to go with this notional funding formula.
And I think it's the same as free school meals funding. It's not enough to cover a free school meal. It's the same as pupil premium is not enough to support all of the disadvantaged children who are in our schools. You could even stretch that to the 15-30 hours in our earlier settings, particularly those of you that have nurseries will know that funding doesn't always stretch to the full cost of provision for those children. So it's in the mix of, I think, how do we use, what I think has happened through the DFE is, there are various pots of funding that make up your budget and they've all kind of merged into one. The reality is now, how do we use all of those in the best way, given that we know that there may not be a headline increase in school budgets, but we know there are rising pressures. So.
Okay. Mandy?
Yeah, I mean, from the point of view of the notional 6,000, which has been there since I was in Baines, and probably when we were in Avon even, so it's been there a long time. But from the point of view of that, I mean, we're having to fight for every penny that we can, and we consider ourselves a pretty inclusive school. Just for an example, we've got a young lad who is in I think he's in year 11, 10 or 11. He's just been given £1,000 in order to support him full-time across the curriculum, because we're supposed to share his support with other students, but he hasn't got, there aren't other students in his classes. So how does that work in terms of making sure that the child gets what he needs? And I'm just using that as an example. We also have had 2 students who we've had to put into out-of-county placements, and we are now funding it, whereby it was funded last year by the local authority. What's going on? Why are EHCP costs being cut from schools when you have the information there in order to make sure that those students can be supported appropriately?
I don't know if I can answer that.
No,
I don't know
not
the context
specifically,
of
but
individual children. I think your question is, I suppose,
how does
yeah.
Just how is how are the decisions made? Because obviously with a child that's in year 10 they've got their exams coming up in the next year, how are we supposed to support a child with £7,000? How's that decision been made?
I won't get into I don't know the specifics of individual children, and it's an needs assessment-led system.
But the assessment says he has to have full-time support.
Again,
if you want
to, if you want to write to me after, I think if there is an example like that, I think where assessment and EHCP says child should be getting full-time one-to-one, and we're not funding one-to-one, I'm happy to look at that. That's absolutely fine.
But what I think my point is, on what basis are these decisions made? Because I can't be the only one who's in this position. Schools across the board are not getting the funding they need. As
I've said, there's this is a collective challenge for all of us. I think I don't know the specifics of an individual child in year 11. We support nearly 6,000 children through the EHCP process. What I think is, if there's an example like that, perhaps we pick up offline from this meeting so I can look at that. There shouldn't really be a discrepancy between an EHCP that says a child should be getting one-to-one and not enough funding. So I can look at it. There might be specific reasons why that's the case. I can't speculate, Mandy. I don't know.
I think the point
what I don't want to do is use the forum to talk about one child in one school, and I think that probably isn't.
But what I'm trying to say is that if you want schools to be inclusive, you can't make decisions like this one. And if that is happening elsewhere...
I think it's probably a bit unfair in terms of not knowing which child you're referring to in the detail. Well, I think what I'm saying, though, generally is that it's not about us individually as a local authority wanting our schools to, we all want our schools to be more inclusive. We all recognise, I think, that there isn't enough funding in the high needs block to achieve all of the support that those children need, which is why there's a deficit.
I understand that.
If there's specifics on an individual case that you or your head want to write to me about, I'm really happy to look at it. I don't know the detail of that.
And I wouldn't expect you to.
So I can't comment, but I know that, we have a team that doesn't make decisions, purely on an economic basis. They are making those decisions through panels, often led by assessments from professionals that determine what a child needs through that assessment model. That is a system we have at the moment, and if there's a discrepancy in funding, that's really happy to look at that. That's fine, but I don't know the context, so I can't comment more than that.
Okay, so thank you. Some good discussion and some wider discussion. So I'm specifically on agenda item 7A. Yeah.
It was actually following on from your point there, because Vicky was saying about explanation or clarification on the different pots of money within the budget and how they potentially could be used to close funding gaps, or around the perception of the notional SEN calculation in the notional budget. I think if you could provide some clarification for that, schools would very much welcome it, because I think we have spoken about an existing individual case, but there is a pattern and trend across multiple schools, and there are gaps in that funding in terms of meeting need. So I think you mentioned it, so I'm just saying we would welcome some clarification on how schools are expected to manage the difference between the notional figure and the actual staffing and support costs that arise from the HCPs, because clarifying this would help schools plan more confidently, and they potentially would understand how their contribution is meant to operate in practice, or what the local authority's perception of that notional budget is.
So I think this is more about the national position. This is not a Bristol unique position. We don't set TA rates and then set, funding rates for teachers. Teachers' pay uplifts are determined nationally by government. We know there have been years in the past where that's not been fully funded, so we haven't seen the equivalent increase in the schools block. That's created a pressure in schools budgets. That's not Bristol City Council. That is a national position set by government, usually through the autumn statement. Similarly for TAs as well, there was a national pay award for those teachers. And again, you know, as I said earlier, there hasn't been the rise in the high needs block or the schools block to meet all of the demands of schools. So this is a broader point, I think, around the funding landscape. Whilst administered by the authority, the pot is set fundamentally by government. Whilst generally, because of the income deprivation affecting children's score that Bristol attracts, we generally have a slightly higher rate than most authorities. Nationally, it is a pressure for all of us. All budgets are under pressure, I think, in schools. So it's not a case that there's more funding that we're not giving you that we should be. I think we're all operating in a system where there is significant pressure in the system, both in terms of falling roles as well. We have falling roles in our schools, which will start to affect budgets. We'll look at those in January when the figures come through, alongside the high needs block as well. So, and again, I just want to make really clear, this is a collective problem for all of us, not there's nothing we are doing as an authority that I think is exacerbating it. If anything, that's where those decisions are made in this room. So.
Okay. Is there anything, and it could be the next one, it could be the one after, some sort of clarification, explanation could be given in a sort of general case?
I suppose what's the question you're asking, and then we can certainly take that away. It depends on the question, because I think if the question is why is there funding pressures in schools, that's a bigger question around the autumn statement on Thursday, I suppose, and what might come nationally. If it's around the high needs block, again, we are, meeting need where we can, and in a deficit as in the high needs block, which is under monitoring by the DfE, obviously. So it depends on.
That's clear. Has anybody got a proposed question that it might be helpful to hear at a future forum, or has the discussion we've had sort of enabled people to understand?
I believe the original question or comment was around the notional. I believe I heard you say, and I could be wrong, that you would offer clarification around how that could be used, or what the local authority's perception of that was, and how it could be used by schools to close funding gaps. So clarification on the notional and how schools can use it effectively within their budget.
It's already in your budgets. It's no different to pupil premium or free school meals funding. It is for schools to determine in line. So if you're an academy, it will be in line with the academy's financial handbook. If it's a maintained school, it's within our scheme for financing schools, and it sets out how schools are accountable for that funding. The other question I suppose you had was, is it enough to support all of the need in schools? I think nationally, I suspect that a number of schools and local authorities would say it probably isn't enough if you think about the national budget or pupil premium funding. But it is in the main, a formula designed to work out the budgets for schools, and for schools then to determine how they use that. I don't know, Louise, I'm just mindful of your role as a CFO in Lighthouse, if you wanted to comment on kind of your perspective from an academy trust.
Well, I mean, we're I think all under huge pressure as the local authority is affecting us also. I recognise some of the concerns that people are saying. All I was going to say is that if we assume that the reform or the information about the reforms comes relatively soon, I would suggest it's best for us to concentrate our efforts on how we can move forward together on the basis of those new reforms to make sure that children's needs are met as effectively as possible. Obviously, if that gets delayed again, then we might have to say, right, well, we need to do something more now. But I think if it is imminent, that would be a really good catalyst for us to saying, right, how can we make sure this system works as best as it can for children?
Thank you. I think that's really helpful point there. Mandy, anything else?
You've mentioned that obviously there's pay awards for TAs, etc., etc. But when we have our funding for a student, it doesn't matter which student it is, we have the same funding for 5 years. So at what point does the amount of money associated with each band get increased by the pay award, or how much money we've got put into that from the government to enhance that banding allocation?
Yeah, I think that's a consequence of the way the high needs funding has been allocated to local authorities, where the DFE haven't uplifted that in line with pay inflation the same as they have done on the schools block, other than recently when they've added the 3.4% in the last about couple of years ago. So that is a genuine issue across the top-up funding, across special school funding, resource-based funding, everywhere. So that is something we definitely need to look at the top-up funding and ensure that inflation is added to that. But it's a consequence of the DFE methodology on high needs funding, unfortunately.
Okay, right, I'm going to move on to agenda item 7 and the discussions on that.
Just to go back to Louise's question before on how many schools have we got at the minimum per pupil funding levels, we've currently got in this current year, 2025-26, 16 primary and 1 secondary. Now that number may well differ when we get into 2026-27 depending on the formula funding allocations, but that's the current number there. Okay. So item 7 is feeding back from the consultation exercise, which covered de-delegation as well as the funding principles for the school's formula for 2026-27. I've highlighted within the report where there's a decision that's allowed to be made by Schools Forum and a recommendation. So you've got decisions or recommendations in principle to consider this evening. So we're asking you to look at the consultation feedback and then make your decision or recommendation around the items listed from the transfer to the high needs block, the minimum funding guarantee, the move towards the national funding formula, the PFI, private finance initiative factor linked to retail price index, the growth fund, and then any priorities for distributing what we call headroom, which is any balance of funding once we've gone through the other formula factors. In terms of the principles, I've said we still await the December DSG announcement. We don't know what the validated October 2025 pupil census looks like yet, which does inform all the pupil characteristics from the age to the free school meal status, the prior attainment status. So we need that data to understand how that then translates into every individual school and academy's formula funding allocation. I'll take you through the paper with the consultation responses, and I'll pause at each relevant stage to just take the Schools Forum decision or recommendations. I'll say they are in principle because we've got, as we've outlined in the paper prior to this, lots of announcements still to receive, and then we'll have done the timeline, so we'll work through this over the Christmas period and bring the detail back in January. That's unfortunately the best we can do with the circumstances and the delayed announcements. I've already taken you through the grant transfers, which were reaffirmed in the DFE update last week. And then in terms of the school funding consultation, again, we've thanked all the schools for their responses. I've detailed the responses from the schools within each question and put a local authority proposal against that, purely for information from pages in the pack that's been distributed from pages 23 onwards. It's about 20 pages. We've copied in all of the school consultation responses per sector, so you can see how each sector responded, plus the comments that were made in response to each question. So you can see that for transparency, and then the Schools Forum Finance subgroup have referred to those comments and will refer back to them again as we start to work through the development of the final funding formula for next year. So page 23 onwards is purely for information. The first area for this evening is for a decision where you're allowed to decide on the schools block transfer, in this case to the high needs block. So this is where we've proposed and consulted with schools on the 0.5% transfer, and we've seen the response of 72% overall schools in favour of that transfer and 28% who voted against it. The local authority proposal on that basis is that we would like to support and recommend the transfer of 0.5% from the schools block to the high needs block for all the reasons we've outlined previously in respect to supporting the pressures that we're facing on the high needs block, which ultimately comes back to support your SEN learners in schools. So I'll pause there. So that's the first item for decision.
So Steve, just before we go through this and each one of those, I just want to get an input from some of the people who were on the subcommittee as well, to give their perspective on the overall process and where we are.
Can I just add as well, obviously, I mentioned previously in the other paper that we have supported this recommendation in the last several years, and we have in our deficit management plan an agreement with the Department for Education committed to include that in future years as well, but it is subject to an annual decision of Schools Forum.
So before we get into the detail, I just want to hear a high level from people who've been involved in some of those detailed discussions. So, don't know. Simon, do you want to say something? Yeah.
I guess what was different this year is obviously due to the delays in getting all the information, a lot of the modelling that Steve did for us was very hypothetical, and also you couldn't really see exactly what the impact was going to be. So thank you, Steve, for all that work that you and you did as well to get us there. But I kind of think we, after a while of going through it, we sort of concluded that we would relook. So the subcommittee are meeting again in early January once Steve's Christmas is ruined by the department, and then so we'll, you know, they'll do that over the Christmas holidays, and then we'll relook at some of the modelling. And I think that meeting was still quite useful just to narrow it down to what areas we would focus on, because I think some of the things that we would maybe like to do we're restricted from doing within the rules of moving towards the national funding formula, but also keeping in mind the focus in the past has always been to put money into the areas of deprivation to serve, you know, our most vulnerable children in Bristol, but sort of at the same time kind of noting that Bristol is now a real outlier of being away from the national funding formula, which is fine if people are happy to do that at some stage, and we don't know what that will be. Is, you know, at some point you'd imagine we'll be told that we now have to be in line with the national funding formula, and we don't know whether there'll be protection for that or what. So that's just sort of worth noting that Bristol is now an outlier in being away from the national funding formula.
Thank you. Anybody else who was at the meet? Mandy?
I mean, on the points where we've got majority decisions by schools, I think as a group we felt that it was important to go along with that, because obviously, particularly with the transfer to the high needs block, there's always that need going to be there. And I know from working in Bath and North East Somerset, we always had a 0.5% transfer as well. So it's something that has been going on for a long time, and I think it'll go on for a lot longer yet, just because of the issues that obviously surround this. But as I say, with regard to the consultation, the majority of the items that we could actually make a decision on, or could discuss that had a decision, if you like, we agreed with the principles.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. Anybody?
Sorry, one other thing, when you get down to 4.13...
You've had your chance.
Sorry. On 4.13, where it talks about what people thought we should do with that headroom that Steve talked about, in terms of whether you put money in the ORPU factors, you put them into AEN factors or whatever. I mean, the responses from people, I think some of the responses were not technically correct, because people said they agreed with one thing, but then they said they agreed with another, which contradicted the original one. But there is a little bit of kind of consistency of to help the subcommittee. So we are kind of narrowing it down to sort of I don't know, 6 scenarios or whatever it was, Steve, that we get to.
2, I think it was.
Yeah.
I think on that point, we did think that maybe it would be more useful to rank these options rather than to have this yes or no, because that was a bit confusing.
Okay, for the future, thank you. Okay, right, so now I think we'll go sort of dive back in, and basically we're at 4.8 in item 7, so schools blocks transfer, Steve, as you described, so are the schools forum happy to confirm that decision? Do I have to put hands up or something? Yeah. Okay, fine, thank you. Right, minimum funding guarantee.
Minimum funding guarantee, again, the question was, do we set the minimum funding guarantee at 0% or minus 0.5%? The consultation articulated that. The Schools Forum have previously recommended the lowest level of minimum funding guarantee, which then ensures, whilst the protections may be lower, there's more of the funding that's delegated directly to schools through the formula funding, and any move to the national funding formula, when it is directed by the DFE, will happen a lot quicker because there's less protected funding to transition away from. You can see there the majority of responses, 97% of schools in favour of the minus 0.5%. Therefore, this is for recommendation, it's not a decision, so ultimately where Schools Forum make recommendations on these next items, they will go to full council budget setting in February for the final decision. It's very rare that the full council budget decisions will vary from Schools Forum recommendations. So 97% in favour. Local authority proposal is to recommend minus 0.5% minimum funding guarantee. The Schools Forum Finance subgroup did support our recommendation, but asked for a right to review once we've got the final funding settlement and we've worked through any further funding scenarios. So it's to support it in principle, but also to reserve the right to review subject to the funding settlement and future developments that we'll hear by January.
Okay. So
just to confirm, so is the School Forum supporting the Finance Subcommittee's position?
that's the so we're going to invite School Forum to confirm the recommendation of the Finance Subgroup, which was
it's the LA
supporting
supported by the
principle.
Finance Subgroup and then ultimately recommended by Forum.
Okay, everybody clear on that? Okay, so can I invite the Forum to confirm, or not confirm the Finance Subgroup recommendation? Okay, anybody again? No, right, thank you. Okay, right, moving towards the national funding formula.
Okay, there was 2 questions in the consultation in respect to this. One of them was not really an option, it's a mandated factor, but we did ask for schools' views if they agreed with the direction of travel from the DFE to move 10% closer to the national funding formula. And then the second question was to whether we agreed to moving directly to the full national funding formula factor values. Again, there's implications with that, and through the Schools Forum Finance Group, we've looked at various options for moving 100% to the national funding formula values, a 10% move, which is mandated, or do we move 50% closer? So the discretion is there for Schools Forum, the local authority, to model these factors. But essentially, because we've not got the relevant funding information, then the proposal from the local authority is to refer to 4.13, which was supported by the finance subgroup, which obviously when we get to 4.13, it's basically saying we need to see the funding information and model everything there. So we did get the responses from schools with 58% of schools in favour of moving directly to the national funding formula values. Lots of comments about Bristol being an outlier, with the only South West authority that isn't mirroring the national funding formula values now, other than one authority, which is just for a minor factor within their formula. But we had an 86% in favour of moving 10% closer. As I say, that's not an option now, and that's been confirmed in the funding announcement last week. So again, we've got the school's views, we just need to model it a bit further now, once we've got the pupil numbers and the funding settlement in December.
So, there's no decision on
that
this.
one, it's just to defer it, basically.
Okay, noted. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to sort of say, I mean, the national funding formula, Steve, Simon and I have been sat on this for a while. 10 years, 8 years that it's coming. We've not seen it yet. And so that this Labour government now, this is the second year that they've decided they're just going to carry on doing what the previous Tory government did, which moved 10% towards it. So that's kind of my first point, really. They could have said, we're going to go, and they've chosen not to. Well, we don't know what the reasons are for that, but we might get some indications from the DFE as to why they've chosen to not move to the national funding formula. And the second thing that I want to point out is that the funding formula is a local authority. We propose it and we decide it. We have a duty to consult, but it isn't a decision for the forum to make. It's a decision for the local authority to make. I'm just going to put that out there as the 5% transfer from the schools block is absolutely the forum's decision, because it's taking it from funding that is directly for schools to go into the High Knees block, which is the local authority. But the formula itself is for the local authority to both propose and decide. And the DFE checks it to make sure that it's regulatory compliant. It's one of the very few sort of levers, if you like, that a local authority still maintains in this very complex and kind of academised system. Is how we choose to fund our schools and what variants we choose to add to whatever those characteristics might be.
Thank you, Christine. That's really helpful.
Yeah. So with
sorry, Simon, then Louise.
So I guess with that, is it so without seeing the kind of numbers for 26-27, I presume the local authority doesn't yet have a view on what model it would prefer, because it hasn't seen the numbers. Is that right, Christine?
Exactly that, and then we'll obviously bring that back to the Schools Forum Finance subgroup in January.
Yeah.
Work through those proposals together, and then the local authority will make that proposal, seek consultation with Schools Forum for recommendations, but as I've already said, and Christine's just said, it will be the local authority decision in February.
The corporate strategy, the main point of the corporate strategy is to break the link between attainment and deprivation. That is an overarching priority for this local authority, and therefore politically the levers that are available to us will be pulled wherever they can be pulled to maximise that. The AEN factors include prior attainment, which plays into SEN, those children with additional needs. So schools that on the one hand argue that they're not getting enough funding for SEN children, but then also argue that they want to go more towards the national funding formula, in my mind, that those two positions are not compatible, and there is some illogic argument within that. Either as a school and as an authority, we're in a position where we're saying we want equal funding for everybody regardless, or we're in a position where we're saying we recognise that Bristol has children that are growing up in the most affluent families in this country, literally, and children growing up in the most deprived families in this country, literally, and we're going to reflect that within our school system. And politically and from an administrational perspective, we are looking to invest in our most disadvantaged and vulnerable children. That is the position that we are taking.
Thank you. Thank you. I think, Louise, do you?
It's a point of principle, really. We may have to move fully to the national funding formula, as you said, at some point in time, but that won't be a decision for this local authority. It'll be a national decision. But I think that we should avoid arbitrarily moving towards the national funding formula unless we are required to do so. Not because I agree or disagree with it, but because I think unless we have a strong evidence base as to why that will be the right thing to do for children and young people, and unless we can honestly understand the equalities implications of doing that, we shouldn't make any arbitrary moves. So as a point of principle for me, I think we should just do what we are required to do by the government with the 10%.
Thank you. Thank you, Lewis. Mandy?
I mean, just to clarify some of the point, I mean, talking about moving to the national funding formula, obviously schools who are dealing with children who are in the low priority, but you know what I mean. Those schools would be devastated if we moved to the funding formula right now, because the AEN would drop like a stone. Unfortunately, we are now going to be mandated not to be able to put more money into the AEN allocations, because we've got to move 10% closer to the allocation. So we can't actually put any more funding that we may have that's been identified into those funding formulas at all now.
But you can protect what you have previously.
Oh yeah,
allocated.
that's what I'm saying. We've got the 10%, but we have to move that 10%. We can't put any further funding into those elements of the formula.
Okay.
So what we yes, we need to move. If the DFE is saying you need to move 10%, we move 10%. But I agree with Louise.
And I agree with Louise.
That the national funding formula would see our most disadvantaged children really losing out on some funding.
Okay, I think actually there's some pretty good consensus there, and we need to run the numbers again, which you will do. Okay, right, I'm going to move on to 411, which is the PFI.
Can I just add, sorry, Chair, in respect to the move to the national funding formula, I've asked the DFE a couple of times, including yesterday, in terms of their timeline. The response I got a couple of weeks ago is that ministers have not yet decided on the full national funding formula timeline. So, what they have decided on the 10% move again. So it's watch this space in that respect. And in respect to the formula considerations, I'm not disagreeing with any of the views at all in the room. But what we're doing with the modelling is looking at the balance, the balance of if we move away from the AEN factors, do you get more back when we shift the funding through the basic per pupil funding? And how do the protections kick in? So this is how we have to look at every individual school, and we'll look at the least adverse impact for the majority of schools with all the formula scenarios. And through that process of elimination, we'll determine the local authority proposal and obviously consult with Schools Forum and the Schools Forum Finance subgroup on that. So we have to work through all.
So I understand we do. Just my advice, caution, whatever it is, I think there's a fairly strong consensus message.
Yep.
So we probably don't need to spend a lot of time modelling things that aren't going to get a tick or something. So let's focus on,
Okay.
Okay.
PFI factor 4.11. Again, we've consulted with schools. We've got 83% of schools in favour of supporting the uplift to the private finance initiative factor, which supports those PFI schools with the costs that they have to face as part of their private finance contract over 25 years, and also to look at the affordability aspects. Again, we're looking at a recommendation in principle. We don't know the amounts yet. We haven't had the RPIX confirmed for next year. That'll be in the December announcements. But ultimately, the recommendation from the school consultation and our proposal is to support that uplift. It's a nil effect for the schools with the PFI allocations. They receive an amount through the funding formula, and that's what they pay back into the overall PFI affordability model.
Okay, so School Forum, go.
Special schools.
Sorry, I know we're probably a separate issue in all of this, but obviously special schools don't get funding through national funding formula or anything like that for their PFI. So in terms of cost, is that going to be looked at separately to this decision?
Yeah, exactly that. We are looking at a separate exercise for the special schools who get a site-specific factor as a part of their high needs funding allocation. We recognise that, because of the DFE methodologies again, hasn't been uplifted for RPIX in previous years. because of how it gets allocated through top-up funding. So we've had lots of conversations with the special schools, and we are looking at that as a separate exercise through the high needs block, which isn't subject to this schools block consultation.
Okay, thank you. So, right, invite schools forum to confirm the recommendation with respect to PFI. Is your hand up?
Yes, sorry.
Thank you. All right, I think it's unanimous. All right, growth fund.
Growth fund, again, majority response from schools, 88% from the consultation responses in favour of retaining the growth fund at the £1 million level, which we previously detailed to Schools Forum is the ongoing commitment for those decisions on growth. So that's our proposal there, to retain the 1 million.
Okay, Lewis, yeah.
Thank you. Sorry to sound like a bit of a stuck record on this one, but if we overestimate the growth fund, it's technically a further transfer out of schools into the high needs block. So I would just want to say that we agree an appropriate level based on need, and if that's £1 million, great, but it should be exactly what we estimate it to be, and if that ends up being a slightly different figure, we should amend the figure accordingly.
Yes, and if I sort of recall at the subcommittee, we had a bit of debate around 1 million sounds like a round number, and then you came up with some evidence, Steve, to say it was actually a justifiable figure because it was actually 1,040,000 or something.
Yeah.
And I think there was also a debate or request, which was at some subsequent schools forum, can we have an update on the utilisation of that growth fund?
Yeah, and just on Louise's point, sorry, we have obviously reduced last year the retention from growth from 2 million down to 1 million because the numbers just weren't there, and that then distributed that £1 million through into schools formula funding. The current estimate is circa 1 million, give or take a bit around it. That will reduce in future years as those year groups drop out, and then it's obviously subject to consideration for future years to retain less growth and distribute that funding to schools and not offset it off the DSG.
Okay.
Yeah, just building on the question of detail about the growth fund, there was a suggestion in a previous forum meeting there was potential for 2 primary schools to access or to apply to access some growth. I'm curious if that came to fruition.
It did. We got, I said it was subject to their evidence. One of the schools was a very small element of growth, just a handful of pupils, which didn't qualify for the growth factor. The other school, we're still waiting on further detail. I know the council has raised some queries on this in respect to PAN. It isn't related to the planned admission number. It's general growth that's affected multiple year groups in that school, which has resulted in an increase of 27 pupils and an additional class being required. So we're still working through validating that data. So out of the 2 schools that had submitted a request last time, there's 1 that's still being considered at the moment.
So just to be completely clear, the tension for me is that there are schools being required to reduce PAN and there are schools at risk of closure or merge closure to meet the need of the very big project with the falling birth rate. So, you know, that needs to be reconciled. I'm sure it is. I guess I'm looking for reassurance that, you know, there aren't schools out there growing whilst there are schools out there being forced to shrink.
Which is exactly the reason that I'm scrutinising and asking about the particularly primary schools, because I was like, what do you mean 2 primary schools are asking for growth fund? I don't think so. But I am also interested to understand which schools are still entitled to growth fund. Because my understanding, it was only secondaries anyway for a number of years. So that's a question. And primaries, we are asking to reduce the PANs across the city. And the same will be the case, you know, those numbers are going to go into secondary in a few years' time. So when this comes back, can we have a breakdown of what schools are getting what and why, I think, is the reason. Why would they be entitled?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and just to say as well that you're right, we do need, we have a surplus of particularly of primary places in the city. I think it's approximately 1,000 children 1,000 places, not 1,000 children, 1,000 fewer children. And it's predominantly because of birth rates, not other factors. We have a much clearer and stronger process for schools that want to breach PAN, and this is particularly where a school might want to go above their PAN and set up a class, but not go through any process for that. So we're making sure that those come through us, and then we will make representations where we need to. And I think this is part of the challenge around, we hold the sufficiency duty as a local authority, and we need to make sure there are sufficient or not too many places. But actually admissions authorities, schools, academies particularly, can sometimes make their own decisions, and we will do our best to make sure that we are holding the line in terms of the PAN for award, and that the admissions are even across those schools, and avoid one school breaching PAN that then draws numbers away from another and causes a financial problem, which we know impacts the breadth of curriculum that you can offer your children. So when Councillor Townsend talks about scrutiny of that, it's conversations that we are having regularly around that. And the period of time when we'll know will be in the summer term, particularly when admissions and preferences have gone out, and we'll see what that brings in real numbers.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. Oh, Wendy?
Steve, do we know how many schools are actually going to possibly receive the extra funding for
We did
growth
bring a
fund?
paper with the schools listed on a previous update to schools forum, so we'll bring
Can't
that to the
remember
next meeting. And it is only secondary schools now,
Yeah.
other than this one primary
Plus-
school that we're looking at for those circumstances I've mentioned.
From memory, 6 or 7
Yeah, it's on. Yeah,
secondary
6 and
schools.
7. Some are at year 11 now, so they won't be
nearly flowing through.
in after next academic year.
It's ones from
Yes,
some time
previous
ago.
decisions that are still working through.
Okay, I think we're on to the last recommendation, and I'm also noting it's 10 to 7. So I'm just going to read out the recommendation. So, which is, agrees with the recommendation made by the Finance Subgroup to support the LA proposal to allow more time to work through the formula funding scenarios once the DSG settlement and funding announcements are received in late December, and to consider the options at a further meeting of the subgroup scheduled in time to inform the final recommendations of Schools Forum in January, which is, we agreed there will be more work, and then the subgroup will meet, and then we'll agree. Okay. Sorry? That's, I'm summarising 413. But if people want to chat about it, go ahead. But that was my summary. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
I think we were going to
Right.
an appropriate
Okay, growth. So the growth, sorry, thank you. The growth fund decision was recommend to support the LA proposal for the growth fund of 1 million.
Is that with the caveat of the precise amount, or we're happy that that's the precise amount? I wasn't clear on the precise amount.
because the funding.
The precise amount is slightly over.
Sure, yeah.
£40. We can put 1,040,000 if it makes everyone feel better. So.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just have it, just minuted to thank Steve and Andrew in advance of their commitment over the Christmas holidays to get this work done. That's not a threat, but it's just knowing that's, yeah. Yes.
Right, now we go on to my 413 and my conditional close, which was all the other stuff, and it will be modelled. So, is everybody happy with that recommendation? Thank you.
Can I just give all forum members the assurance we're looking at all options? I've mentioned in the paper we've looked at 24 scenarios so far. We're looking at every single aspect of the funding formula. We've whittled it down to 2, which I won't go through in detail because they're subject to further development once we get the funding announcements. So ultimately, through that process, we will determine the best possible outcome through the funding formula for the majority of schools. There will be some schools that lose undoubtedly some schools have got falling pupil numbers and they will have to manage that. But hopefully you've got the assurance that we're doing everything possible to get the best outcome for the schools that we can.
Okay, thank you. Right, the next meeting will be 21st of January at 5 p.m. It will be here, so it's in person. It is a different date from the one which was published a long time ago, but was the date which was agreed at the last forum. 21st of January, next meeting. Anybody got anything else they want to throw on the table? In which case, I'll declare the meeting finished and thank you for your contributions.